Hello, my name is Greg Bull. I'm a technical advisor here at Goujon Brothers. Today we're going to be working on a old door that used to have a cassette type doorknob on it. We're going to fill that in and put a regular doorknob in it. We're also going to fill in the deadbolt lock so we can possibly do another one in there if needed. The approach I'm going to take to work on this is I need to remove the old paint first. I think that's going to be pretty good for actually doing the repair in those areas. So now that I've got my paint all removed, you need to come back in and do some sanding. I did the scraping on the surface to get the paint off. You can come back with like a sanding block and sand the surface, but the sanding block's too big to get inside to do my sanding inside where the cartridge was. So what I've did is I took a couple paint sticks, a little bit of tape on them. I've got some, happens to be adhesive backed 80 grit sandpaper. Now I can get in here without getting my fingers rammed in there to sand the surface, to clean up any loose debris, loose wood, paint, anything else that might be in there. Just kind of make a nice smooth surface and flip it over and use it for the top and or for the bottom. Kind of clean that up. Looks like a fair amount of rotten wood in there that I'm pulling out real quick. Something else you can use, I use quite a bit of, is you could actually go to a file. You can use the flat edge of a file and run in there. It's already fairly coarse. It'll work to clean your surfaces out. I've got a little bit of a hole on the top, so I can actually use the radius end of the file to kind of clean that surface up, or a round file to kind of get down into the finer areas, to kind of clean those up and straighten them out a little bit. The epoxy will get into the soft or bad punky wood and harden it up, so I don't have to remove all of it, but it's nice to remove the majority of it so you've got a good solid bond when you put your pieces back together. For my deadbolt up top, I'll have to use either my half round file in here to kind of sand or braid that surface. I'll probably finish up with the small file, round file, to kind of clean the surfaces up so I get a good bond for my dowel rod that'll go back in there. Yeah, as I'm filing away here, you can use power tools, so I could get like a Dremel tool out to kind of do a lot of this cleaning, but being that this is such a soft wood and it's old and a little bit rotten, it seems to be going away pretty quickly and easily with file and sandpaper. So you may get the Dremel tool out, but you don't necessarily have to. This is cleaning it up pretty nicely, actually. Just fairing everything in, trying to get any of the roughness off the surface. All the paint was removed with scraping in that, especially around the doorknob or door handle. So I'm just kind of coming back in and just kind of helping smooth or level everything out. There's still an impression of the old door handle mount that is bigger than the actual door handle or hole that's cut out here. Kind of runs up and back to 6 or 7 inches long. Kind of knocking that down a little bit make it a little bit easier when I do finish up and we end up painting it or whatever we're going to do to the surface. So on the deadbolt hole up here, I'm going to need to sand that a little bit. So sanding on this isn't getting the paint that's down in the grain of the wood. So I will come back with the corner of my scraper and just scrape down in there, just so I'm not bonding to old paint that might come off later after I either have epoxy on the surface or we're doing the finish work, doing the painting, and so priming and painting on top of it. As you're seeing, I'm kind of leaving some grooves and some roughness there. I'm not too worried about that. When I do put my plug in here, I'll have extra epoxy, so I'll be able to put that over the surface to help smooth it in. So I'll be able to come back and do a light sand on that, and I'll probably leave about what I just scraped out in the lows and be back down to the wood surface and be a nice smooth surface for us to finish. So I've got some fractured wood that I'm going to have to end up filling, which is fine, because I'm going to have to, when I put my dowel rod in, I'll have excess epoxy, so I'll just make sure that I get a little bit of thickened or unthickened epoxy down in these cracks and that I'm finding. When I was sanding on it, in my sanding strokes, I could kind of hear a little bit of a vibration noise, and that's just some of the fractured wood on the surface. So what I'm going to do here is I've noticed I've still got some painting that in where the square part of the cassette is what I'm calling it, I don't know the true terminology of it, was attached. So I still have some paint that's down in here. It was difficult to get at with my scraper, so I'm going to come back in and use a chisel to try to just remove or scrape some of that paint away, and some soft wood or rotten wood in here also. So I'm going to use a straight edge or a ruler to see how big of a piece I need to actually cut. I've found my scrap piece of plywood that is going to be bigger than the void area that I need to fill at this point, so I can set it on top of and it won't slide into. If I tip it on a corner, it does slide into the area, and it's a little bit loose, which is good because then I'll be able to put thickened epoxy on the surface when I push it in there, and it'll seal it all up and fill all the voids around it. So I'm going to need something that's going to be 3.5 deep, 3.5 by 4.25. I've come back from cutting my piece of wood. I've noticed that it'll fit in out at the entrance, if you want to call it that, but it doesn't slide back in very far. So like if I turn it the other way, it goes in and it's loose up and down on the door, so to speak. So I know I've got to trim it a little bit more. And I'm feeling as I slide it back and forth that there's a little bit of radiuses or corners inside. So I'm going to trim it down a little bit lengthwise. So I'll trim this edge down, probably trim this edge down, and then I'll put radiuses on both of the inside corners so it'll slide in better. And now it should slide in there. Still a little tight. So that's going to be some of the things you'll have to look out for when you're doing this, just like working on an old boat, working on an old door or what have you. You may have to keep shaving stuff down. It's a little bit tight, a little bit top and bottom. So kind of keep working that to get it to fit in there. As I've slid this piece in and out a couple of times, there's starting to be some marks. And those are just tight areas that are inside. And you can also see it on the bottom side is the same thing. There's a little bit of a tightness back in here, over on this side. So kind of there's a little bit of some squeeze points, so to speak, that are inside the door that I haven't either sanded or removed, or it's better wood so it didn't remove as easily. So I'll have to change or modify my piece that I'm putting in there a little bit to fit in there. I'll have thickened epoxy and stuff around it, so that will take up any differences. If I go a little bit too much or something like that, they'll still be nice and tight with the epoxy. So I've stepped away and I've done some trimming on my wooden piece. It now slides in and fits in pretty easily now. So it's be a smooth surface, even it's in ever so slightly, so I'll have a little bit of epoxy on the outside of it when I come back and epoxy it. It's still ever so slightly snug, so I do have to kind of work it out a little bit, but it pops in and out of there. It's a little bit different shape than what I originally thought it was going to be, but that's the way it is. Now that I've got my first piece cut and made for my door handle, my deadbolt that I'm calling it, which is a circle, it's about 1.25 inches in diameter, I will step away and cut my dowel rod pieces for that. I just took a hole saw and cut a piece of 2x4. I'm going to use this surface as my bottom surface. It'll be against the table, so it'll stay nice and flat. When I put my tape across here, the tape will actually help hold it in place and seal it up so that I hopefully don't have any leaks of epoxy, and then I will have to come back in and fill this in. The reason it's not sitting flush on this side is because of our shelf on the window. To bond in my pieces of wood, I'm going to mix a little bit of epoxy up. I'm going to first wet out the surfaces, even my pieces of plywood that I'm going to put into the voids. I'm going to use our 410 Microlight to help bond and take up space. It's going to be about the same density and strength of the wood that's on the surface and of the wood that I'm inserting into it. Yeah, as I'm mixing epoxy, I like to jump from resin to hardener, just going back and forth between them. So if I get interrupted or anything like that, I don't have to have a count. You know, if I did like 5 pumps of resin and then started to do some hardener and the phone rang, somebody asked a question, what have you, and I've lost track of where I was, I would have to throw the epoxy out that I've started to mix. Once I have my epoxy mixed, I will be brushing and coating out my wood surfaces. The reason for doing that is to allow the epoxy to soak into the wood. I've removed a lot of old or rotten wood out of here, but I want to, whatever's left, I want to coat or seal in there, so to speak. So that's what I'm going to be doing now with the epoxy. I'll kind of get in here and coat out the inside. It'll kind of soak in and change the color of the wood ever so slightly so you can kind of see where you're at. And then I'm also going to be adding some of the filler to my next batch of epoxy to finish filling in where my piece of wood slides into. I also have a small crack on the front here that I'm going to just put a little bit of epoxy into just to seal it up. All right, so I think I've got everything pretty well coated out with my neat or unthickened epoxy. So for my deadbolt here, I'm just making sure that I've got everything coated out. I ran a hole saw down through the hole here just to help clean it up. So it was pretty good. You could use sandpaper or possibly a round file to help also clean it up. Once again, the wood's darkening up as I wet it out, so I know I've got everything coated. A little bit around the surface here, some little chips and pieces missing that'll get filled in with our thickened epoxy. I'm also wetting out my pieces that are going to go into the door. So I'll do this one for my deadbolt first, just because it's a little bit smaller. Then once I have this wet out, I'm just going to set it off to the side here for a little bit until I get my thickened epoxy made up. Let's see if I should have enough here to wet out my piece of plywood. Need to make sure that I wet the edges. This is the end grain. The epoxy will soak into the end grain of the wood more so than the flat grain top and bottom, per se. This gets a little bit on the messy side when you first start doing this. So hanging on to wet epoxy, but don't let that scare you or anything. It's perfectly fine to do. You got the gloves on there, so it's staying off your fingers, so to speak. And the reason I'm kind of going to end up using 2 cups, I'm going to mix a little more epoxy up to thicken up to fill in there. So I'm using our Fast Hardener. And depending on the temperature you're working in and your skill level of how fast you want to work, it may start to kick off if you tried to just mix up one big batch, did 2 or 3 pumps or 4 pumps, and then did all your coating out and then added filler to it. By then it may start to kick off in that. You only have about 20 minutes of pot life to get everything mixed in and applied. With the low density fillers, you'll actually gain or expand the amount of epoxy that you have. Adding a filler in will give you a little bit more than what you initially start out with. One thing to keep in mind as you're mixing the epoxy, you want to make sure you scrape the sides and the bottom to get everything thoroughly mixed. You can do that with just the neat epoxy or unthickened epoxy and as you're mixing the thickened epoxy together. And now I've got a nice thick peanut butter type consistency. I'm going to actually put some in through the doorknob handle. And I'm not worried about being overly neat, just trying to coat everything out, all the little air voids and spaces that are in here. A little bit on the top and bottom of where the new piece of wood's going to slide into or slide against. I think I'm looking pretty good. I'm going to just put a little bit around the edges, top and bottom, and around the edges and that. I think I've got plenty in there to get it to squirt out all over the place, which is what you want. That's what we call squeeze out. Remember, I'm going to have a little bit of a void on top here, so I'll have a little bit of a space for the thickened epoxy to go to. If I get a fair amount of squeeze out, I can use it to help fill in those areas. So sliding this piece in here now, got to kind of wiggle it back and forth so the epoxy keeps moving. Having everything wet out with neat epoxy will allow the thickened epoxy to slide around ever so slightly. And pushing, then giving it the epoxy a moment to set. When I get done pushing, as you can see, I've got a little bit of squeeze out on top and coming out where I inserted the piece of plywood. Now I'll go through and just finish filling this top piece in. One of the tricks I like to do when I'm filling a void like this is kind of start away from it and kind of where I have thickened epoxy already, just add some more and it'll kind of squeeze over into the area. So that way you know you're getting all the air out of it. And once I think I've kind of got it, I'm gonna do a squeegee across the whole top. As you can see, as I push on it, you can kind of see it moving around. So you have to be aware of that because you may end up with a little bit of a low spot. And then I'm also gonna fill in the screw holes and stuff on the door edge. Okay, so now I have my basic door handle area filled in. Fill in my old screw holes. You may notice I have a little bit excess on here, but with the 410, it'll sand down pretty easily. Get thickened epoxy all the way around my little plug, and I'll slide that piece in. Have to wiggle it around a little bit. And that's where it wants to stop. So I've got a little bit of excess around here, so that's good. I can spread it around to fill in any of the little roughness of the actual door itself. So it looks like I'll have to trim my little plug piece, which I expected to have to. But I can either cut that off, sand it off, plane it off. I still have my little hole from my hole saw that I put in here. A little more epoxy to fill that in. And there we go. Now just to make sure everything is filled and smooth and leveled off kind of how I want it. Form your flat surfaces because that bridges across the area that you're filling. There we go. I think I'll let that set and dry now. And just come back and do a light sand on it. Hopefully I don't have to do another fill, but I may. And we'll have our door basically filled in, at least from this side. I still have to do a little bit of work on the bottom side that's on the tabletop at this point. As I'm filling this, something to take note of is the way epoxy works, it's a chemical reaction. So the more mass of it you have, the warmer the epoxy generates a little bit of heat, the warmer it can get. So doing this, I should be fine. If you have a larger area that you're gonna be filling, if you didn't like slide the piece of plywood that I had in there, and you just tried to fill that whole void, you would probably wanna do it in a couple of applications so it didn't get too hot. You'd put an application on, wait for about an hour and a half or so, and then come back in and put another application on. It'll still chemically bond well, but it won't generate as much heat as if you just filled that whole area in with thickened epoxy. Now that my epoxy is cured, I need to sand these areas smooth. I'm going to use a combination of sanding blocks. I've got a smaller sanding block that's got 80 grit sandpaper on one side and a coarse 40 grit sandpaper on the other. And I just have a larger sanding block here that I'll probably use for the deadbolt. That'd just be easier to get my little high spot down. My plug was a little bit long and is protruding through ever so slightly. I just need to sand that smooth. So to do that, I'll just come back in with it and start filing, sanding that down. Now I'm switching over to my sanding block with the 80 grit sandpaper on it to kind of help finish it up. So I'm starting to get some little bit deeper scratches from using the real coarse sandpaper to knock the high plug down. That's feeling pretty good now. You see I kind of got it all smoothed down, knocked down to a nice even surface. I've kind of finished sanding with the grain of the wood just to help hide any of my scratches that I have in there for when I do come back in, paint it, or whatever I'm going to finish it off with. And then moving down to my other spot where the actual doorknob was and the cartridge was in here. I guess I will sand the edge first. You can see that I've got some epoxy that's kind of left over. One of the reasons I like to work on plastic is that it pulls right off of plastic. So now I have a little bit, some of these pieces here that when I sand it, they'll sand off pretty quick and easily. For most part, it's getting real close to where I need it to be. Looks like I've got a couple little low spots that I may have to come in and do a little bit of filling, but I can do that when I do my fill on the back side. For sanding my top area smooth, I'm going to go back to my coarser sandpaper, my 40 grit, and kind of rough it in. It's pretty close. My little edge piece here that I put some epoxy on is a little bit proud. It's a little bit high from putting my thickened epoxy and epoxy on it, but it's a nice solid piece so I can sand it down and make it smooth. It's not going to break or flake off. I'm going to switch over to my 80 grit to kind of finish it off here. It's getting really pretty nice and smooth. Feeling pretty good. So I've flipped the door over and now I'm going to remove the tape from the surface that I put on here before we put the plugs in and did the epoxying on the other side. And you can see that the tape is just pulling off of the wooden surface obviously, and it's pulling off the epoxied surface. Now down to my doorknob area. Looks kind of bad. It's a little black in color, dark in color. That's some of the old or bad wood that it's been coated out. And that pulled off also. I've got a little bit along my edge that I could feel from when I was sanding my door edge surface. I've got a fair amount of epoxy here, then I've got a little hollow spot that I'll have to abrade and then fill in. Chamfer in the edge so it'll make it easier so it's not a hard or sharp point, so it's easier to get the sandpaper down into the low spot so I can abrade that. I might have to do a little bit of scraping down at the bottom to just have a braided surface or a surface that the next layer of epoxy will bond into. I'm not too worried about how much I take off because I am going to be filling it again. So if I take a little bit more than I really probably should have, so be it. I'm going to fill it back in with some more thickened epoxy. But I'm also finding a little bit of a void right along this edge that I can open up ever so slightly. It's not really going to be pretty by any means to abrade the surface, but just have to have some sort of abrasion for the next layer of epoxy to bond to. I would think something like that's going to work out good. Yeah, I've sanded my whole surface. I've actually got my real deep low spot. Then along this back side is nice and shiny still. And that's a little bit of a low area that I could try sanding it down, but I'm gonna remove a lot of wood. So I'll just come back in and just abrade or scuff that area up that's right back in there. And then when I fill it, the next layer of epoxy has something to bite or grab onto. Sort of the same thing on my edge here too. I've got some little bit shiny or low spots that I need to fill in. I'm kind of doing it all by hand. And then for up on my through bolt area, I've got a little bit of my epoxy that came through. It's a little bit high, so I'll knock that down real quick. I'm gonna use the coarse 36 paper first. My thought is possibly to put a piece of tape along my edge of the door, kind of like this piece of sandpaper, so then I have a place to run my epoxy out to. I'll have a little bit of a lip there. That'll give me a sharper, more precise edge. Now that I get the dust out of the way, I can see any little shiny spots. All right, I'm pretty happy with that now. I think I will go ahead and mix some thickened epoxy up and do my fills. On my doorknob, I don't necessarily have to use any unthickened epoxy first because all of the wood has basically been sealed up and now sanded and have more epoxy, thickened epoxy put over it. For my deadbolt, because I've got a lot of surface area here that is just raw wood, I will probably mix up a little bit of epoxy, brush some on here first, just to penetrate in and get a better bond with the thickened epoxy. In the area that's just raw wood, I want to put a little bit of epoxy down so it'll soak in and give me a little better bond. And I'm being fairly liberal on how much epoxy I'm putting on here, knowing that it's going to soak into the wood a fair amount. I'll give it a moment to set up as I fill my doorknob area, so this will soak in nicely. I'm going to go back to some of my 410 and thicken up my neat epoxy. I'll probably go a little bit thinner this time, more like a mayonnaise type consistency instead of the peanut butter type consistency. So as before, it's a little bit looser, it's moved slightly. That should be good for filling my doorknob area. I'll start by and I'll come back with my trusty squeegee and smooth it out. That'll give me a nice surface to sand smooth. There'll be a little bit of sanding there to get it knocked down again, but it's pretty close. And then remember I had sanded my spots on the edge. Back in and put my thickened epoxy on it. It's a little bit rough there again. I'll take my squeegee, work across the area again. And there we go. Just kind of start in the back and kind of start working it down. And as I push it down, you can kind of see it splay out. That's what I want. I want to see that kind of splay out to kind of fill any low areas. So if I just came in there and squeegeed across it, I may end up having some areas that have little air pockets in it. So I just start back in, put more epoxy down where I started, kind of work it. As I push it down and kind of squeezes out or moves slightly, I can work it down in all my little grooves, the screw holes that might be there. It's actually pushing my tape out a little bit on my edge here, but that's all right. Like I said, if I have to, I can do a little bit of block sanding right on that edge and recreate that corner. But now I know I've got plenty of epoxy there to do that. All right, I'm going to come back with my squeegee once again. And it looks a little bumpy, but I think it's going to level out nicely. A little bit high, a little bit proud. So I should be able to sand that down and be a nice smooth surface. Once it's painted, nobody will ever know there was a hole there. Okay, so now that I have my areas filled, the one with the deadbolt and then the back side of the regular doorknob, and then I did a small refill on my front surface. I'm going to come back in and re-sand these surfaces to make them nice and smooth again. I am hitting a little bit of it, so it's a little bit proud, so that's good. Because I did try to push a little bit into it when I was filling, so it would be out a little bit, but not very much. It's not going to take very much sanding at all to make that nice and smooth. There's going to be a little bit more filling I have to do in my hole that I filled in, because I'm a little bit low. So actually, people say, well, it shrunk up. Well, the epoxy didn't really shrink, kind of soaked into the wood a little bit and lowered itself. So I have to come back in and do a little bit of sanding around that area so I can put a thin film of epoxy over the surface. It'll be the same mixture of the 105 resin with 205 hardener with the 410 filler. Okay, now I'm going to finish doing a light sand over the area where the doorknob was and where I put my piece of wood inside and along my face here on the edge. That's looking pretty good, feels good. It's a little bit sharper than the rest of the wooden door, so I'll just take just a little bit of sandpaper, just real gently kind of go across that just to break it ever so slightly. Paint will stick better to it. Epoxy would bond better to it if you wanted to come back and put another coat of epoxy on it. But I think that's going to be pretty close. I've resanded a couple of my low areas. I had a low area on the doorknob that I would need to refill a little bit on my edge, and actually had a couple little dimples around the side of the area that is for, or was for the deadbolt. So I'm mixed up a little more epoxy, our 105, 205 with our 410 Microlight. I'll put some of that on here now. All right, so now to kind of do our final sanding on the surfaces, I've come back in and done a light fill on my doorknob and my deadbolt on both sides. So I can do a light sand on the surface now to make sure that I have a nice smooth surface to put my paint or my finish on. And then same thing for my deadbolt. We did a couple little fills. So I'll just take my sanding block and knock that down a little bit. Okay, so I've sanded this side of my door. I can flip the door over now and sand the back side, or the bottom side at this point, that I did a light fill on when I did my fills here and here. So then I will be ready for primer and or paint to finish off the door area. So now that we've kind of got the whole door in primer, we've fixed our doorknob and our deadbolt areas so that we can go back in and put a new doorknob in wherever it might need to be. It's a nice and smooth surface, and nobody will ever know that there was a different doorknob on this.